here. We have learned a lot in these 2 days of conference. I hope you too. We have enjoyed a lot of the conversations that we had, and we hope that you enjoy also this last talk. I'm Maria, this is Priyanka, and we are going to be talking about adding ethical lens to your development and your product lifecycle. So in the last year, we have seen a revolution in AI in general and generative AI in particular. This is shaping the way that we work, and it's also shaping the products that we build. The breakthrough on large language model development has lowered the barrier to access to resources that prior were either too expensive or were reserved to academia and R&D teams. And this has led to a widespread use of AI, not just in the industry, but also in our everyday use. And as we have seen a lot in the talks that we have seen during the conference and the conversations that we have had just outside. This trend will obviously continue. The unprecedented adoption of generative AI is not just driven by the easier access to that technology. It's also led by the curiosity and eagerness to experiment with it that lives in all of us. AI is obviously at the forefront of the technology, will continue to do so in the future. All of these developments have also driven the tech industry to build tools, platforms, and frameworks around it. The ecosystem is complex, it's growing, it's very exciting to see. But I want us to look at the question of how is this actually reflecting in our society.
So as we look around us, we see that AI is already being used in industries with great success. We see its seamless integration in real-time translations and personalization and recommendation systems. Moreover, some of the AI integrations that we will see in future have great potential to increase the quality of our lives and improve efficiency. For example, one of the things that I am super excited about is the use of AI in healthcare in the coming times. I've been working on a healthcare project in the past 1 year where we are focusing on optimizing the clinical and procedural workflows that transform patient care. One of the use cases includes using AI as a companion to doctors in real-time diagnosis. Another use case is using AI to automate report creations based on images from these tests. This enables the healthcare practitioners to use their time more efficiently and increases the quality of their care. However, with all of these exciting things happening, we cannot ignore the negative human impact of AI, and there are numerous examples that we have seen of this. Some of the most recent ones includes the writer strikes and the usage of deepfakes for political agenda. AI has contributed in spreading misinformation and aggravating the existing biases and discrimination in our society. We also need to acknowledge that some of the LLMs that we are using today have been trained on data without explicit consent or copyright data. As engineers building with AI, we need to think more about our role in shaping the future of our society. While building products with AI, we need to remember that these systems are not built by a sentient AI, but by people like us, people in this room. So, in a way, it is up to us to be aware of the ethical consequences of our work. We need to remember that regulations are behind technology, and they are still playing catch-up. So, we cannot really rely on them to guide us to do the right thing. Therefore, we need to consciously include ethics in our day-to-day work in a sustainable way. At BCGX, we have already been building products with AI for a while. But in the last 1 year in particular, both Maria and I have been focused to build products with AI, particularly in GenAI. So we wanted to share our learnings and enable you to build your products in an ethical way. To help you with this, we will present you with techniques and practices that you can incorporate in different stages of software delivery lifecycle. We choose this framework because everyone in this room is already using this in some capacity in their organization. Before we begin, I wanted to start with some assumptions that we have taken. We will assume that every role, like PM, design, or QA, participates in some capacity at each stage. Also, we want to remind you that we are here to focus on ethics and responsible AI, and we assume that the best engineering practices are already in place. Finally, we want to emphasize that any examples that we are giving are just to illustrate a point and not a specific critique on their makers. We have to remember that this technology is in a nascent stage, and we're all trying to do our best. So let's dive in, starting with the first phase, that is planning. First and foremost, just like functional and non-functional requirements, you can also think about defining the ethical requirements for your product. Some of the things that you want to think about in this stage would be, does your company have an ethical or responsible AI framework? If you do not have one, this is a good time to talk to your leadership and build one. This could be a good guiding principle throughout the product's lifecycle. You should also take into account the data that you will need and the consent and the privacy around it. In particular, focus on the sensitive data and how will you manage it across the product's lifecycle. Another thing to think about is the risks that are associated with your system, especially the data that you're using for training, the use cases, the unintended use of it. A good reference to this is to use a threat modeling framework and apply an ethical lens to it. Another way is to think about the functional risks of your system and the ethical issues that can arise from them. The second thing you might want to do at this point is to identify the new skills and capabilities that you and your team would need and build on them. Some of these might be technical, like MLOps or AgentOps, and some of them might be non-technical, like social sciences and regulatory knowledge. You should think about how can you fulfill them. Maybe there is a data privacy officer already in your organization. Maybe there's an information security team. Maybe there's a social science team. You can also bring out external support or train your team in some of these capabilities. Lastly, but not the least, you really need to think about, do you really need AI for this, or is this FOMO? A good way to go about this is, think if your use case really fits an AI solution. Also compare the benefits versus the risks. Think about the consent for the data that you're using and the type of the model that will fit your use case. Is it custom? Is it fine-tuned? Or something else? Once you've figured out the decision and you've made a decision to use AI and you've figured out the ethical requirements, you've laid the foundation for your project. And now it is time to move to the next phase, which is design. The first thing that you can do differently is to start by thinking about the disrupted and not just the disruptor. And a way to go about it is to think about the humans that you might be affecting in this case. For example, there was a recruitment tool that Amazon was building a while back, and they scrapped it when they realized that there was a gender bias that was associated with it. And this was because the model was trained based on the resumes that had been given to the company in the past 10 years. Most of these resumes were of men, and hence the model was preferring men over women. We also see other examples. For example, in DALI, when we input terms like doctor or a teacher, the output might have a gender bias. Also, while we are focusing on building GenAI and automating some of the customer support processes, this might lead to a reduction in workforce and have impact on people's lives. It is time to think about the second or the third degree consequence of the work that you're doing and adapt to it. One way to achieve this is to involve the users that are the end users in your product from the start. You might also consider to involve the disrupted users right from the start. It is all really important to think about the user, not just the user experience, but the human impact of the work that you're doing and the biases that you might aggravate, like the gender bias in case of the recruitment tool. Another way is to design for explainability and transparency. AI should not be treated like a black box. And as builders, we should know why our model is giving an outcome and how can we communicate it to the end users. if we try to build for transparency for the users right from the start, it can help us to uncover hidden biases in our system. Moreover, this will also help you find the limitations in your model or data set along the way. And maybe you can communicate this to the users as well if you cannot mitigate them. For example, if your model is not optimized for a particular language, you can let your users know right from the start.
Cool. So let's move to development. When we are developing any AI system and we want to make it more ethical, a good place to start is, as we referred to already, is the data that we are going to use. So we should think about, where is that data coming from? Is it user data? Is it proprietary data from our business? How are we going to use it? Where are we going to expose it to, or who are we going to expose it to? It's important that we also try to minimize the amount of data that we use to find out what is that minimum data required for our feature of our product to work. Because the less data, the less risk that we add, and also the less bias that our system be. We'll also look for transparency in terms of how we are communicating to our user how the data is going to use and what our intent is. So, this talks about that in disclaimers, this talks about modifying our consent settings, etc., etc. More likely than not, we would like to use usage and behavioral data to retrain our models and to fine-tune our products. So let's be transparent about that. In some cases, you may also want to consider whether you can keep alive the same feature or an earlier version of the feature that was less maybe intrusive, if that's a possibility, and allow users to opt out and to go back to that earlier version. Next up is authenticity. How do we ensure that LLMs or any other models is providing accurate and non-harmful information to our users? We can do this by a combination of prompt engineering in one hand and also applying or using some very useful guardrails. Guardrails in this kind of a scenario, they tackle a problem in two ways. Some of them will look at the user inputs and filter out anything that is harmful or doesn't match with your requirements. That's, for example, how ChatGPT question filter works. Some other tools will use that and will also add another filter at the outputs of the LLM. And again, they will filter out some of those responses to ensure not just the responses are in line with whatever business requirements and business tone of voice, but also with any ethical or any information that might not be, or that might be harmful to the user. Azure AI content safety is one of the examples that we put here. Any other cloud provider that you may use, or model provider would also have a similar tool. Last but not least, like with any other system, we should build it to be observable, right? Just using open telemetry to start gathering some data points, especially around interactions with the LLMs, which is the black box that Priyanka mentioned before, that can take us a long way. We can start looking at, as we are developing, and actually what is the data that we are sending as context, how is the data being transformed, and how is that used by the LLM. If we are using, in some cases, depending on the tech stack that we are using, we can also use more, not advanced, but specific tools. We are using LangChain to build an agent. You might want to use or to pay for the Landsmith license, and that can give you a lot of things out of the box. This will also be very useful, not just when you are developing, but also later on when you are maintaining your product in production. In summary, it's important that we develop with transparency, observability, authenticity as first-class citizens, keep them at the forefront of our mind, as the models, the data set that we use, are going to have limitations, especially if we are using pre-trained public models that are obviously not adopted to our specific use case. We need to be able to identify some of those limitations and then develop to mitigate them. Let's now move to testing, because a product is not just how we build it, it's also how we ensure a certain level of quality to the system that sits behind it. And we should try to do that in the most deterministic way possible. There are many types of testing that you can do. This is a subject that could and should deserve a talk on its own. These people much smarter than me who have spent most of the entire professional life just looking at how to test and validate and improve the outcomes of models, AI models, machine learning, etc. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just going to give you like 3 examples of type of testing that you might want to add to your toolbox that can help you to also make, as I said, your product a little bit more ethical. Starting with bias and authenticity. So this is about examining, reporting, mitigating discrimination and bias in AI models. There are a few open source tools that you can use, like the ones that I mentioned in here. The ecosystem is growing, again, excited. And they cover quite an extensive range of tests. You can do something very simple like just ensuring that the responses that your text generation agent are free of, or they lower the amount of bias that it has, or that even the image generated by your AI is also kind of low or lower in the discrimination on the bias that it might have. Next up is correctness. So, we talk about it as well in development. This is about how we ensure that we are giving an answer that is truthful and that also is not harmful to our users or the business. We can enrich our process and all the guardrails that we have put in place, but you also use some automated tools like deep eval, or just by doing some very selective exploratory testing. Last is robustness. So again, these are wide buckets of things that cover many aspects. But here we're trying to see how resilient and, ready for attacks your system might have. This covers a lot of things. You can look to adversarial testing, which is a method for evaluating models, where you look at the outputs where those models are being fed with malicious or harmful inputs. You can also look at prompt attacks. You can look at training data extractions. Again, there are many tests. There are many tools that you can also use, guidelines as well. OWASP presented early this year the top 10 for LLMs, and I would say that that's a pretty good place to start. Because with these, as we know, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So we should be prepared, especially when we are looking at using very sensitive user data from our products. This can be a lot, very overwhelming, all of this dimension. There are a lot of tools that can help you automate all of this. You can also look into what are the manual processes that you will need to put in place, what type of exploratory testing, how are you enabling the people doing those type of testing to be able to shift their mindsets. So they are trying to look for, holes and flaws in your system. Let me just get some water here. So next, we would like to obviously deploy our application and make it available to the rest of the world. We're very happy with what we have. Well, this is just like goods, products, development and deployment practices, ensuring that we are aligned with any security guidelines, especially any regulations that we might have in the regions that we are deploying our application to, and also just make sure that we are taking with whatever ethical requirements, responsible AI guidelines our organization might have. Like how we are treating information, the type of responses that we are giving, what is the tone of voice that our agents, that's what we're building, is providing to the user. Something that is very important is that if you're using one of the public models, ensure that those reside on the same region where your data resides. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of awkward conversations as data might move across regions, and that's probably not the great thing. You can also consider doing a stage rollouts or canary releases. that will allow you to gather additional early feedback, that will allow you to maybe uncover some unintended consequences or mild misuses of the product before you make it available to a wider audience. And once our product is in production, we still need to maintain it. So again, very normal in product development. We put it in production, we measure it, we gather feedback, and based on that feedback, we iterate and we keep developing. So that will be the same thing. It's important that you define and streamline the process of testing your models as they get advanced and they get new releases in the markets. You also keep testing your data sets. And again, you probably are going to be enriching them to make sure that they are aligned with your own ethical requirements. And something that we want to highlight here, which is what are the metrics that you might want to consider or the KPIs that you might want to track once a product is in production. Again, there's tons of them. We're just giving you a small subset that we found useful. So the first one is in terms of the quality of the model. Here you can start looking at what is the authenticity or correctness rate. So that's the percentage of responses provided by the model which are incorrect or invalid. Also the safety score, the number of harmful categories or topics that might be considered sensitive for the end user or for the business that again were provided by the product or the model. And another one that is very important is bias responses. So what are the differences of model outcomes across different population subsets or questions? This is obviously a bit tricky to track. Some of them feel very abstract. Some of the tools that I mentioned in the testing section can help you to track and measure some of this. You can also use just good old synthetic monitoring. You can define sets or a suite of tests and use cases, and then you can run them against your production system and start looking at the results and trying to identify patterns. In terms of the quality of the system, there are many metrics that you can do, error rates, throughput, etc. In this particular case, we wanted to highlight something around data relevance. We mentioned that before. To which degree the data that you're using is necessary to fulfill the product's goals to fulfill that feature, because the more data that you add, the more risk of having a biased response or to provide harmful responses or to being exposed to attacks and expose that data to unintended actors. And also last, we all want to measure the impact of the product in terms of business outcomes. Using a user satisfaction survey, something like NPS or similar, can help us with that. Might be good to add some extra questions that help us assess how safe our users feel while using our products, whether it aligns with their expectations from an ethical perspective, etc. So to summarize, we have given you what we hope are useful nuggets and insights across the life cycle of our products that you can take with you and start applying in your products and teams starting tomorrow. This includes things like defining the ethical requirements, design for transparency, build with authenticity and transparency as well as first-class citizens, change or modify your mindset in terms of how you test your application as a whole, align with privacy and ethical regulations before you deploy, and then measure some key ethical metrics. Regulations, as we mentioned at the beginning, are behind technology, so please go beyond them. Don't wait for regulation to hit. We need to be prepared before that. It is our responsibility to act and to adapt from educating ourselves in ethics and social science to redefining our roles and the processes that we use. This is an iterative process. You won't make it right the first time, but you can definitely make it better.
Thank you.